April 28, 1945. The war was breathing its last in a world that no longer believed in victory. Dawn broke gray over the shattered fields of northern Germany, where the wind carried the scent of smoke, diesel, and something faintly human: despair. Behind barbed wire fences, hundreds of German women stood in formation. They were no longer auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht or the Luftwaffe. They were prisoners now. Captured clerks, nurses, radio operators, and flak gunners, faces pale beneath the harsh morning light. Their uniforms, once pressed with pride, were torn, muddied, and stained by weeks of retreat. A British officer stepped forward, his voice flat and final. The order was translated, then repeated down the line. Each woman was to remove her uniform, insignias, belts, caps, and throw them into a pit already prepared with kerosene-soaked rags. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, the women obeyed. The smell of burning wool and leather rose into the damp air. Some stared. Others cried silently. In that quiet inferno, years of belief and indoctrination turned to ash. The Reich was ending, not with banners and speeches, but with smoke curling from the uniforms of those who once served it. By the spring of 1945, Germany was a nation in collapse. The Third Reich, which had promised 1,000 years of glory, was disintegrating in less than 12. Allied bombers darkened the skies over cities that were once symbols of precision and power. Berlin was a carcass of brick and bone, split by artillery and Soviet tanks advancing block by block. The Rhine had been crossed, the Ruhr pocket sealed, and the Wehrmacht, once the most formidable army in Europe, was retreating through its own ruins. Amid this chaos, the lines of distinction between soldier, civilian, and captive blurred until they were almost meaningless. Among the millions caught in this unraveling were the women of Germany's war machine, the Helferinnen. They were secretaries in the Wehrmacht command posts, operators of anti-aircraft guns, radio specialists transmitting desperate orders, and nurses attending to the wounded in underground hospitals. By 1944, over 500,000 women were in uniformed service, bound by the Reich's promise that they too were soldiers of destiny. Their uniforms were symbols of honor and belonging, stitched with insignias that tied them to Hitler's vision of a disciplined, total nation. Many were volunteers, others conscripted through the machinery of a system that demanded obedience above conscience. In propaganda films, they were shown smiling beside soldiers, their hair tucked neatly beneath field caps, eyes bright with faith in a war already lost. Yet the reality was far from glamorous. As Allied forces swept across Europe, these women found themselves increasingly on the front lines of defeat, manning radar stations as the Luftwaffe disappeared from the skies, coordinating artillery batteries that no longer received ammunition, and caring for soldiers too wounded to be moved. The Reich's order demanded discipline even as it crumbled around them. When Allied forces finally broke through Germany's defenses in early 1945, many Helferinnen were captured alongside soldiers. Some tried to discard their uniforms to pass as civilians. Others held on to them as the last thread of identity they had left. In many Allied camps, confusion reigned. The conventions of war had rarely accounted for female POWs in such numbers. British and American officers faced moral and logistical challenges. Should these women be treated as combatants, collaborators, or victims? Reports from camps near Lübeck, Hanover, and Schleswig described scenes of uncertainty. Hundreds of captured German women sitting in fields, guarded by soldiers equally unsure of what to do next. For the women themselves, captivity brought a strange reversal of order. Those who once commanded respect as representatives of the Reich were now stripped of authority, waiting for orders from their enemies. Some clung to discipline, maintaining ranks, cleaning their uniforms, even saluting officers who no longer existed. Others broke down entirely, unable to reconcile loyalty with the sudden moral vacuum. A few still believed in the Führer's promises, convinced that Germany would rise again, but most simply felt empty, hollowed out by exhaustion, disbelief, and shame. In the final days of April, as Allied command began organizing prisoner transport and denazification procedures, a symbolic order was issued in several camps. All captured personnel of the Nazi state, including female auxiliaries, were to remove and destroy their uniforms. Officially, it was a measure of practicality and control. In reality, it became a ritual of dismantling. To burn the uniform was to sever the last link between these women and the ideology that had shaped them. For the British and Americans overseeing the process, it was also an act of containment, both literal and psychological. Uniforms carried insignias of a regime responsible for atrocities now being uncovered daily in liberated camps. To allow them to remain intact was to risk preserving symbols of defiance. Yet for the women, that same fabric represented years of duty, friendship, and identity. The uniform had made them part of something larger. Now it would make them face who they truly were without it. As they stood in the cold air of northern Germany, hearing the order translated by interpreters, many of them realized the war had reached its truest end. Not when Berlin fell, not when Hitler's speeches stopped, but when they, the ordinary servants of a collapsing empire, were told to let go of everything that had defined them, even the clothes on their backs. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, the role of German women in uniformed service stood as both a symbol of total mobilization and a testament to how far the Nazi regime had extended its reach into every layer of society. When Joseph Goebbels declared Totaler Krieg, total war, in February 1943, the Reich's final stage of desperation had already begun. Every able body was to serve, every resource to be consumed by the machinery of survival. For German women, this meant a new kind of enlistment, not merely as nurses or clerks, but as soldiers in everything but name. They became Flakhelferinnen, auxiliary anti-aircraft operators, standing beside boys barely 16, tracking Allied bombers that filled the sky in endless waves. They manned searchlights, loaded ammunition, and operated telephones under the roar of engines and the thunder of explosions. They became Luftnachrichtenhelferinnen, handling air defense communications, Nachrichtenhelferinnen of the Wehrmacht, typing coded orders that few of them fully understood. They were promised pride and protection under the eagle and swastika, a symbol that for many had come to replace faith itself. By 1945, that promise was broken. Cities lay in ruins, families displaced, and millions of refugees streamed east to west, seeking safety from the advancing Red Army. In the chaos, female auxiliaries found themselves caught between two collapsing worlds, the empire they had served and the one that was about to occupy them. Some surrendered willingly to the Western Allies, desperate to avoid Soviet captivity. Others fled on foot, discarding their insignias, hoping anonymity might spare them. In captured camps across northern Germany, scenes repeated themselves with eerie uniformity. Rows of women in tattered uniforms, their once sharp creases softened by mud and rain, awaited processing by British or American soldiers. Interrogations were brief, almost mechanical. Questions of rank, assignment, and political affiliation determined whether one was sent to a detention facility, a labor camp, or released as a civilian. For Allied officers, the presence of these women posed an unexpected dilemma. The Geneva Convention offered no clear category for them. They were not traditional combatants, yet their roles had directly supported the war effort, transmitting orders, manning defenses, and in some cases serving within SS command structures. The moral complexity of their position blurred the boundaries between guilt and circumstance. Were they ideologues or merely instruments of a regime that had consumed everyone it touched? Historical records from British field reports in May 1945 show the tone of confusion. In one note from an officer stationed near Lübeck, he described hundreds of women auxiliaries of the Luftwaffe awaiting orders, many in tears, all in disbelief. They do not yet understand that their service, their authority, and their uniforms are finished. That sense of disbelief became the emotional core of their captivity. The uniforms themselves held a power beyond practicality. Each insignia, each armband represented a structure of belonging. The lightning bolts of the SS, the eagle of the Wehrmacht, the red chevron of the Luftwaffe. These were not just symbols of a regime, but social armor. For years, they had conferred dignity and purpose. Now, under Allied guard, they became marks of shame. The women who once wore them with pride now hid them under coats or blankets. There was a psychological fracture at play, a moment when collective identity gave way to individual conscience. Some women wept openly when ordered to surrender their uniforms. Others complied with mechanical obedience, too numb to feel. A few resisted, clinging to their caps and jackets as if to their very skin. But the order would stand. Every piece of cloth, every emblem that carried the Nazi insignia would be destroyed. In later testimonies collected by post-war German historians, many of these women described that moment not as liberation, but as disorientation. One former Wehrmachthelferin from Kiel recalled, "We had believed we were helping Germany survive. When they told us to burn our uniforms, I felt as if I had been told to burn myself. It was not ideology alone that shattered that day, it was identity." By mid-May 1945, the camps of Schleswig-Holstein and Lower Saxony were filled with thousands of German women, waiting for repatriation or labor assignments. The smell of smoke from burned uniforms lingered for days. British photographers captured images of piles of charred fabric and discarded insignias, though most were never widely published. The Allies understood the power of those images and the danger of glorifying the defeated symbols. What remained were people, stripped of rank, stripped of certainty, stripped of illusion. They were neither heroes nor monsters, only witnesses to the collapse of a world they had once believed unshakable. And yet, within that quiet ruin, a question remained. How could belief so powerful, so consuming, evaporate in the span of a single morning? That question, silent, unanswered, would define the years of reckoning to come. To understand the moment those German women were ordered to burn their Nazi uniforms, one must look beyond the act itself and into the many angles that shaped it. The human, the ideological, the psychological, and the moral. Each tells a different story of war, identity, and collapse. The human angle, duty, fear, and disillusionment. The women of the Third Reich's auxiliary forces were not born soldiers. Many came from families shattered by the First World War, daughters of men who had marched home in defeat, sisters of boys who never returned. In 1933, the Nazi rise to power promised renewal, discipline, and belonging. For many young women, especially from rural or working-class backgrounds, joining the Wehrmacht auxiliaries or Flakhelferinnenkorps offered escape from poverty and purpose in chaos. Recruitment posters portrayed them as guardians of the homeland, poised, confident, indispensable. Inside the service, their days were regimented: dawn briefings, communications duty, coded transmissions, and nightly alerts as Allied bombers approached. In cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin, female auxiliaries worked in the dim blue glow of radar screens while sirens screamed overhead. They believed they were defending their homeland, not serving a dying ideology, yet the propaganda machine blurred that distinction. Every order was framed as loyalty to Germany, not to Hitler. When the war ended, that belief collapsed overnight. The uniform was once a badge of pride, and it became a mark of complicity. To many Allied soldiers, these women symbolized the system that had bombed London, invaded Poland, and exterminated millions. The women themselves, though rarely combatants, bore the weight of that guilt. When told to destroy their uniforms, some complied quietly. Others trembled as if dismantling their own lives. The ideological angle, faith in a false fatherland ideology, had run deep. For over a decade, German youth had been raised under the Bund Deutscher Mädel, League of German Girls. Its purpose was simple: to instill devotion to the Führer and the German ideal. When war came, those same girls became clerks, signalers, and medics for the Wehrmacht. Their loyalty wasn't to politics, it was to the fatherland that propaganda had painted as divine. Burning their uniforms wasn't just the disposal of clothing, it was the erasure of identity. The act symbolized a forced confrontation with truth, that they had served a lie, and that the ideals they'd believed were righteous had led only to ashes. A former Luftwaffe assistant interviewed in 1947 put it bluntly, "They told us to serve Germany. Only later did we learn we were serving madness." For the Allies, the order to burn uniforms carried symbolic weight as well. It wasn't only about security or sanitation. It was about ensuring that no symbol of Nazism would survive to inspire future generations. Every armband burned was another step toward erasing the imagery that had hypnotized a nation. Yet ideology doesn't burn easily. Beneath the smoke and fabric, the psychological conditioning of 12 years lingered. Loyalty, fear, and pride now turned to silence, confusion, and shame. The moral angle, between innocence and accountability. Morality in war is never simple. Many of these women had never fired a weapon or taken a life. Yet their service had sustained a regime responsible for genocide. Some historians have argued that their complicity was passive. Others contend that the lines between participant and bystander blur when the state itself commits atrocities. In Allied camps, interrogators faced that moral puzzle daily. Reports from British detention officers described women who wept when shown photographs of concentration camps, genuinely unaware, or claiming to be, of what had been done in their name. Others refused to believe it, dismissing the images as propaganda. To them, Germany's defeat wasn't just military, it was moral disintegration. One officer's diary from a camp near Hanover recorded a haunting moment. They asked if they could pray before the fire. Then, as the uniforms burned, one young woman said quietly, "May God forgive us if we did not know." The line between ignorance and guilt dissolved in the heat of those flames. The enemy's angle, the Allied perspective for Allied troops, especially those who had fought across Europe, the sight of German women in uniform provoked a complicated response. Some saw them as victims, indoctrinated, expendable, and now abandoned by their collapsing nation. Others viewed them as part of the enemy machine that had rained destruction across Europe. The order to burn uniforms was both symbolic and practical. Allied command feared that Nazi symbols might spark underground movements or allow imposters to blend in. Destroying uniforms eliminated those risks. Yet for many soldiers, watching women weep as their clothing burned humanized the enemy in unexpected ways. A corporal from the British 11th Armored Division wrote home, "They looked no older than my sister. And as their coats turned to smoke, I realized the war had consumed us all, not just the guilty." In that moment, the victors saw the defeated not as monsters, but as people swallowed by ideology. It didn't excuse the crimes of the Reich, but it reminded the world that war's victims often wore many faces. The technological angle, the machinery of collapse, even as uniforms burned. The remnants of the Nazi war machine surrounded the camps. Broken tanks, wrecked aircraft, and burned-out communication trucks stood as silent witnesses to the fall of a militarized society. For years, women like the Wehrmacht-Helferinnen had operated these machines, typing reports on Enigma-coded typewriters, coordinating troop movements via radio, maintaining supply chains that stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga. When the Allies dismantled those systems, they weren't just ending a war, they were dismantling the world these women had lived within. The uniforms were the human layer of that machinery, the living extension of an industrial war state. To destroy them was to end the illusion of invincibility that had sustained Germany for 12 years. When the last sleeve or cap was thrown into the fire, the air carried the heavy scent of wool, leather, and smoke, the physical end of an empire that had clothed itself in myth. The fire flickered into embers, but its meaning was not yet spent. From those ashes would rise the reckoning, the confrontation with guilt, survival, and the haunting question of identity after ideology. The psychological angle, the shattering of identity for the German women standing before the fire. The act of burning their uniforms wasn't simply symbolic, it was psychological collapse in motion. War had given them order, schedules, ranks, routines. Every day had been dictated by discipline, by uniformity, by a shared purpose that provided certainty in a world tearing itself apart. When that order vanished, they were left stripped of identity. The uniform had given them belonging. It told them who they were. Wehrmacht-Helferin, Flakhelferin, SS-Schreibkraft. Without it, many didn't know what to call themselves. Reports from Allied psychologists described cases of acute disassociation, anxiety, and guilt among female POWs in 1945-46. Some women clung to fragments of their service clothing like relics of lost certainty. Others destroyed even their personal letters, terrified of what connection to the Nazi apparatus might bring. In post-war interviews, former Luftwaffe assistants spoke of recurring dreams, not of bombs or death, but of the uniform itself. One recalled, "I dreamed my jacket was alive. It begged me not to burn it, but I knew it was poison." That psychological tension between the comfort of identity and the horror of what it represented haunted many for years. The mind, conditioned for obedience, struggled to adapt to freedom. The Allies called this the paralysis of denazification. For these women, Guilt and loss fused into a single emotion: shame. Shame for what they believed, for what they didn't know, and for surviving when others didn't. The emotional angle, the moment of the flame eyewitnesses often recall the sound before they recall the sight. The low, crackling hum as cloth catches fire, the faint hiss of wet wool, the dull roar as insignia turned to smoke. Some women sobbed openly, others stared in silence, their faces set in disbelief. The cultural angle, women, war, and rewriting. Memory post-war Germany struggled with how to remember these women. For decades, they were largely erased from the nation's collective memory, overshadowed by soldiers, generals, and male guilt. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht persisted, and the role of women as enablers of a genocidal regime remained an uncomfortable truth. Yet history slowly shifted. By the late 20th century, historians began examining the social machinery that had drawn hundreds of thousands of women into the Nazi system. Books like Hitler's Furies and archives of the Bund Deutscher Mädel revealed a pattern: that the regime had relied heavily on female labor and loyalty to sustain itself. The burning of uniforms, once seen as a symbolic gesture, became understood as a microcosm of national reprogramming. Culturally, it marked the beginning of silence, the era when women returned to bombed-out homes, married returning soldiers, and rarely spoke of their service. Many hid their past entirely, raising children in a new Germany built on forgetting. Only decades later did some begin to speak, cautiously, anonymously, about what it felt like to burn their uniforms, to feel history collapsing in their hands. Those recollections became vital to understanding the psychological architecture of the Third Reich, how propaganda could mold gender, faith, and duty into one powerful ideology, and how the act of burning a uniform could become an act of national therapy. The symbolic angle: fire as purification and punishment in every culture. Fire has meant two things: destruction and cleansing. For these German women, it was both. The flames destroyed evidence of service, but also symbolically purified them of their past. The Allied commanders may not have framed it that way, but many women did. Some prayed as they burned their clothes, others whispered apologies to no one. In camp reports from Austria and northern Germany, Allied officers noted that women requested to burn their uniforms voluntarily. The act gave them a sense of control, a way to reclaim agency in a life stripped bare by defeat. Yet for others, it was forced punishment, a humiliation in front of male guards and fellow prisoners. The difference lay in perception. One woman's redemption was another's disgrace. But the flames consumed both with equal indifference. The swastika armband, the eagle insignia, the iron buttons, all reduced to gray ash. Fire didn't care who believed or who obeyed. It only ended what remained. Coup, the generational angle, the legacy of silence. When these women returned home, few spoke of what happened. Their children and grandchildren often discovered their pasts only through photographs hidden in drawers or letters tucked into books. The silence was deliberate. Speaking meant risking shame, from neighbors, from husbands, from history itself. Yet that silence became a kind of national inheritance. Modern Germany's relationship with its Nazi past is shaped as much by what was said as by what was not. The burning of uniforms, though a brief moment in 1945, became symbolic of the country's ongoing attempt to burn away its guilt, to rebuild from moral ashes. The grandchildren of those women, now historians, artists, journalists, have sought to understand their grandmothers not as villains, but as products of their time, to ask not how could they, but why did they? And in that question lies the continuing relevance of that single act of fire. The uniforms turned to ash, but the story didn't end there. The embers glowed long after, lighting the path toward the war's final reckoning, the moment when the collapse of ideology met the brutal reality of surrender. It was April 1945. Across Central Europe, the war was in its death throes. Cities lay in ruins and roads were flooded with refugees, women, children, and broken soldiers in torn gray coats. In makeshift Allied camps that had once been German barracks, tens of thousands of women, former auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks of the Nazi war machine, waited behind barbed wire. The orders came quietly at first, murmured by Allied officers and translators, all uniforms to be surrendered and destroyed. It sounded procedural, another step in the process of disarmament. But the impact was deeper than any command they had heard before. At the camp near Fallingbostel, British guards began collecting crates of Wehrmacht tunics, Luftwaffe skirts, SS insignia, and caps. The air was heavy with spring rain and mud, the smoke of distant fires staining the horizon. The women lined up in silence, clutching their uniforms as if they were the last proof of existence. Some had worn them for years, even as the Reich crumbled around them. A British sergeant later wrote in his report, "They came forward one by one, some trembling, others defiant. But when the first tunic caught fire, I saw faces collapse. It was as if their world had finally vanished in that smoke." The flames rose high in the camp square, licking the sky, consuming emblems of a lost empire. The fire reflected off wet cobblestones, casting flickering light on faces streaked with tears. Each uniform thrown in carried a personal history, months of service, of obedience, of belief. Some women hesitated, clutching their jackets to their chests, unable to let go. Others threw theirs in quickly, almost violently, as if to punish themselves. The Allied command had made the decision as part of Operation Eclipse, the sweeping program to dismantle the Nazi war apparatus. Every symbol, from swastika banners to officer caps, was to be seized or destroyed. But this moment, this order went beyond military policy. It was psychological warfare, an attempt to erase ideology through ritual humiliation and cleansing. In many camps, the fire was accompanied by forced lectures. Allied officers explained the crimes of the Reich, the camps, the killings, the ideology that had turned Europe into a graveyard. For the women standing in line, disbelief mingled with shock. Some refused to believe the reports. Others broke down when shown photographs from Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. A young interpreter recalled how one female signal operator, upon seeing the images, dropped her hat into the fire and screamed, "This is not what we fought for." The moment was raw, almost unbearable, the sound of faith breaking. In another camp outside Vienna, Soviet officers handled the process differently. They stripped the women of their uniforms roughly, tossing them into heaps. To the Red Army, these women represented not merely enemies, but accomplices, the ones who had sent radio messages guiding bombers over Leningrad, who had typed orders for deportations. Their destruction of uniforms was not symbolic redemption. It was vengeance. Some were beaten, some humiliated in public squares. In Allied zones, the approach was less violent but just as devastating. The American forces insisted that German women POWs replace their uniforms with plain gray garments marked German PW, sewn in red. Photographs from the camps show the contrast. The proud cuts of tailored Nazi uniforms replaced by shapeless, anonymous fabric. The transformation was immediate and brutal, from identity to anonymity. For many, this was the moment they truly became prisoners, not of the Allies, but of history itself. Psychologists attached to the U.S. Army noted a profound emotional collapse among the women during this period. One officer wrote in his diary, "It is not hunger or fear that breaks them. It is the loss of the uniform, the end of belonging. Their posture changes, their speech slows. It's as though they've been unmade." The act of burning uniforms had another consequence: the destruction of hierarchy. In the Reich, even among women, rank had defined worth. A Luftwaffe teleprinter girl stood above a field nurse. An SS clerk outranked a civilian secretary. But in the camp, when all were dressed in the same coarse gray, those divisions vanished. It was equality born of defeat. And as the flames consumed the last fragments of the Third Reich's female army, a strange silence fell. For the first time in years, there were no ranks, no orders, no songs, only the crackle of burning cloth and the steady fall of rain. That night, the camp smelled of smoke and damp wool. Some women gathered in corners, whispering prayers or holding hands. Others sat staring into the embers long after the guards had left. A few tore off small pieces of scorched fabric, hiding them away as secret tokens of the life they'd lost. In that moment, among the ash, the silence, the tears, the psychological war began. For these women, surrender was not the end of fighting. It was the beginning of understanding. The next morning, Allied officers distributed leaflets explaining Germany's unconditional surrender. The Reich was officially gone, but the women who had served it still lived in its shadow. The uniform was gone, Yet its ghost lingered in every gesture, every silence, every memory, and as the smoke cleared, another phase began. The long process of reckoning, of confronting guilt and survival in a land where both had become indistinguishable. By late April 1945, the Reich's empire of steel and blood had disintegrated. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was hiding beneath the city in his bunker and across the ruins of Europe. The last remnants of his ideology burned, not just in the capital, but in the hearts of those who once served it. For the German women POWs, the order to burn their uniforms had marked the physical end of their service. What followed next was the spiritual collapse. In Allied interrogation centers, the women were questioned endlessly. Where did you serve? Who did you report to? What did you know? Most had been clerks, nurses, or communication staff, ordinary jobs under extraordinary circumstances. Yet their proximity to power made them witnesses to the machinery of destruction. Many broke down not under accusation but under revelation. When the Allies confronted them with photographs and film from liberated camps, skeletal survivors, heaps of corpses, children behind barbed wire, the reaction was almost universal disbelief. Propaganda, some whispered. Impossible, others cried. But denial faded quickly when the evidence piled higher than excuses. A British intelligence officer later wrote, "It was as though a mirror had been placed before them. They saw what they had served, what their uniforms had stood for, and they could not look away." At the camp near Neu-Ulm, a group of former Luftwaffe assistants were shown footage from Dachau. Several fainted. One tore at her new prison clothes, shouting that she wanted her old uniform back, to burn it again, to burn herself with it. Another collapsed, repeating only one phrase, "I didn't know." This phrase, "Ich wusste es nicht," became the defining chorus of post-war Germany. I didn't know. It was whispered in villages, in homes, in prison barracks. Sometimes it was true. Many women had not known the scale of extermination or the full scope of Nazi crimes. But others had known enough. The rumors, the missing neighbors, the trains that left and never returned. For Allied officers and psychologists, this phrase revealed the heart of Germany's reckoning. Not simply what its citizens had done, but what they had chosen not to see. The interrogations became less about intelligence gathering and more about moral excavation. In some camps, priests and chaplains were brought in to speak to the women. Their sermons were gentle but unflinching, about guilt, responsibility, and humanity. Some women wept openly. Others remained stone-faced, unwilling to yield their inner defenses. A U.S. Army chaplain stationed in Bavaria recorded one haunting conversation. "I told them their uniforms were ashes now, that they could choose what to build from the ruins." One woman asked, "What if the ruins are inside us?" The chaplain didn't answer. He simply wrote, "That question is Germany." Outside the camps, the country itself reflected that same broken psychology. Cities were blackened skeletons of their former glory. Roads were lined with orphans and widows. In the countryside, families buried medals and photographs, hoping to erase their past before the occupation forces arrived. Burning, both literal and symbolic, became the rhythm of survival. Meanwhile, the Allied command pushed forward with denazification, a vast bureaucratic process to cleanse Germany of its fascist ideology. For the women POWs, this meant written confessions, identity reviews, and participation in education sessions. They were shown documentaries detailing Nazi crimes, sometimes in the very theaters where they once watched propaganda films of victory. The contrast was devastating. One Allied observer wrote, "The women sat in silence, their faces white, their hands clasped tightly together. When the film ended, no one spoke." It was not the silence of defiance. It was the silence of realization. In those moments, tears were not just grief. They were recognition. Recognition that the uniform they had burned had represented something far darker than pride or patriotism. It had been the symbol of obedience to a lie. Yet amid the collapse, small gestures of humanity emerged. Allied nurses and German women worked side by side in post-war hospitals treating wounded civilians. Some formed quiet friendships bound not by ideology but by shared exhaustion. Food was scarce, life uncertain. But for the first time, these women lived without the shield of uniform or hierarchy. They were simply human again. And yet the past refused to vanish completely. Even after surrender, whispers of loyalty lingered. Some women still clung to the myth of the Führer, believing he would return or that reports of his suicide were Allied propaganda. In May 1945, a group of former SS typists refused to eat, declaring they would die as soldiers of the Reich. The Allied guards simply waited. Hunger, not reason, ended their resistance. Others transformed inwardly, rejecting everything they had once stood for. They sought forgiveness not through words but through silence, through decades of quiet labor in the ruins of their nation. The transformation of these women mirrored the transformation of Germany itself, from uniform to ashes, from ashes to accountability. And yet, even as the war ended, the emotional war had only begun. The guilt would outlive the guns. The shame would echo for generations. Those who had once marched in precision now walked through rubble barefoot, their once ordered world reduced to chaos. Their faces, photographed by Allied correspondents, tell the story better than any record, blank, hollow, and heavy with something more enduring than defeat. Awareness. Awareness that they had served a machine that devoured the world. Awareness that the fire they once watched rise in the camp was not just burning uniforms, it was burning illusions. From that point on, every dawn in post-war Germany began the same way, under a sky still faintly stained with the smoke of history. By the summer of 1945, the war was over, but Germany was unrecognizable. Cities lay in heaps of stone and smoke, bridges hung broken across rivers, and railway lines led only to silence. Amid the wreckage, millions of displaced people wandered aimlessly, survivors of camps, prisoners of war, and returning soldiers. But among them were also the German women who had once served the Reich, now stripped of their uniforms and waiting for a place in a world that no longer wanted them. In the Allied occupation zones, these women faced a dual sentence, one written by history and one written by humanity. On paper, they were classified as minor offenders or followers, part of the broad process of denazification. But in spirit, they carried a deeper weight, the invisible sentence of collective guilt. For many, the immediate aftermath was survival. Allied records show that tens of thousands of former Nazi auxiliaries were absorbed into labor programs. Some were assigned to clear rubble from bombed-out streets. Others worked in hospitals or kitchens under supervision. The once disciplined order of the Reich had turned into a life of subsistence and silence. Food was rationed, heat was scarce, and the nights were filled with the distant hum of Allied trucks. But the most haunting presence was not physical hunger, it was memory. Every time they looked at their own hands, once gloved in the tidy precision of Nazi service, they saw ash. The fire that had devoured their uniforms had not stopped burning inside them. In letters confiscated from internment camps, the emotional toll is visible. "I no longer dream in color," wrote one former Wehrmacht Helferin, "only in gray." Another, who had worked as a radio operator in the Luftwaffe, described watching Allied soldiers distribute food to starving German children. "They are feeding the children we abandoned to fate. I cannot bear it." For the Allies, dealing with these women posed a dilemma. They were not combatants, but they were not innocent either. They had typed the orders that sent men to the front, decoded messages that helped armies move, and maintained the communications web that sustained a regime of death. Yet punishing them like soldiers seemed unjust. So instead, re-education became the tool of transformation. Under American and British supervision, former Nazi personnel were required to attend screenings of films like Death Mills, a brutal montage of concentration camp footage compiled by Billy Wilder and commissioned by the US government. The goal was simple: confrontation. The reactions were mixed. Some fainted. Others stared in stunned disbelief. A few turned away, refusing to look. But among many women, something cracked. The propaganda they had believed in, the moral certainty that had sustained them through years of war, dissolved under the unbearable reality of human suffering. In those darkened rooms, illuminated by flickering projectors, the true aftermath of war unfolded, not in gunfire but in silence. Outside, the Allied powers worked to rebuild the world these women had helped destroy. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945, broadcasting to the world the testimonies and horrors of Nazi crimes. For the women in camps and small towns across Germany, the names Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop were familiar. Some had typed their memos, filed their signatures, or served tea in their offices. Now they watched them condemned to death. It was the final breaking point for many. The ideology that had once promised unity and pride had become a curse, whispered only in shame. And yet in the ruins, a strange kind of clarity took hold. The act of burning the uniforms had not been the end of punishment. It had been the beginning of purification. The flames had destroyed the symbols of a lie. But what followed was far more painful: the reckoning with truth. In Allied reports from 1946, psychologists noted signs of what they called ideological disillusionment, a process not unlike grief. The stages were identical: denial, anger, depression, acceptance. Except in this case, what had died was not a person but a belief. The ruins of Germany were not just physical. They were moral, psychological, and generational. And within that landscape of ashes and rebuilding, the women who had once stood before the fire began to learn the hardest lesson of all: that sometimes the only way to survive history is to carry its weight. By 1947, 2 years after the Reich's collapse, Germany was no longer a nation but a divided landscape of occupation zones, ration cards, and fractured identities. The rubble women, Trümmerfrauen, became the symbol of endurance and reconstruction. With bare hands and shovels, they cleared the ruins of Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, and Munich. Many of them had once worn the very uniforms that now existed only in memory, reduced to smoke and guilt. The same hands that once saluted the Führer now lifted stones from the wreckage. They worked without complaint, without ceremony. Their labor rebuilt not just streets and buildings, but also fragments of dignity. Allied photographers often captured them against a backdrop of destruction. Hair tied back, faces streaked with dust, surrounded by the broken bones of cities. To the outside world, they became the face of post-war Germany's repentance. But behind those faces, shame lingered like a shadow. The denazification tribunals, or Spruchkammern, continued their slow process of judgment. Each German was required to complete a questionnaire, 131 questions asking about their activities, affiliations, and beliefs. For former women auxiliaries, the process was particularly humiliating. They were often dismissed as naive followers or misled patriots, yet the psychological scar ran deeper than the paperwork could show. To admit guilt was to face moral exile from their own youth. Some tried to start anew. In the Western zones, women sought work as teachers, clerks, or nurses. The Allies encouraged female employment as part of the democratization effort, a way to replace the militarized womanhood of the Nazi era with one defined by civic participation. Still, whispers of the past trailed them. A former Luftwaffe typist might find herself teaching in a school run by the same Allies who had bombed her city. A former SS nurse might be tending wounds inflicted by the regime she once served. For others, silence became a form of self-defense. Families avoided the subject of the war entirely. Mothers never told their children about the uniforms they had burned. The next generation, and the Kriegskinder, grew up sensing the weight of secrets in their homes. Only decades later would many Germans begin to ask their mothers what they had done during the war and why. But in 1947, survival left little time for reflection. Hunger was everywhere. Entire families lived in cellars or abandoned barracks. Currency reform had not yet stabilized the economy. Cigarettes were worth more than money. And amid this struggle, gender roles shifted in ways no one had expected. The war that had taken Germany's men had left women to rebuild it. In interviews conducted by American sociologists, many women expressed a paradoxical pride, not in the Reich, but in having endured its downfall. "We were deceived," one woman said, "but we endured when the deceivers fell." It was an uneasy kind of redemption, the recognition that survival itself was an act of rebellion against the ideology that had destroyed them. Yet even endurance had its limits. For years after the war, women POWs remained in Soviet camps, subjected to hard labor and re-education. Some would not return until the early 1950s. Their homecomings were marked not by parades but by silence. No one wanted to remember. The new Germany, divided between East and West, was too busy defining its future to confront its past. In the East, the communist regime recast former Nazi women as victims of fascism, recruiting them into socialist work brigades and political organizations. In the West, the Marshall Plan poured money into rebuilding industry, but moral reconstruction lagged behind. Churches filled the gap, offering forgiveness through faith. But even there, some could not pray. For the women who had stood before that burning pit in 1945, the image never left them. Some spoke of it years later. The heat, the smell of wool and smoke, the way the ashes drifted upward and then fell back like black snow. It became in their memory a private reckoning, a funeral for a belief, a confession without words. By 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was born. A new constitution, a new flag, a new beginning. Yet beneath the fresh layers of democracy lay the same question that haunted every former soldier, officer, and auxiliary. Who were we? And what had we done? The uniforms were gone. The ideology was dead. But the memories and the scars remained, buried beneath the rebuilt streets and smiling faces of a reborn nation. And as Germany stepped into the modern world, one truth lingered like smoke from an old fire: the understanding that the price of following blind conviction is always paid in silence, long after the flames have died. The image of German women standing before the fire, tossing their uniforms into the flames, endures as one of the most haunting symbols of war's aftermath. It was not just clothing that burned. It was identity, belief, and the fragile illusions of duty. In those flames, history revealed a fundamental truth. Ideology can shape lives, but it can also vanish in an instant, leaving behind only human beings grappling with conscience. For the women who survived, the act of destruction was both punishment and liberation. The uniforms had bound them to a system that demanded obedience and faith in a narrative of supremacy and hatred. When those garments disintegrated into ash, so too did the rigid hierarchy, the unquestioned orders, and the sense of invincibility that had once defined their world. They were left exposed, vulnerable, human, and confronted by the reality of their actions, choices, and silence. The broader lesson extends beyond the campfires of 1945. It is a reminder that war is not only fought on battlefields, but within the hearts and minds of those who participate. Whether actively or passively, every uniform carries a story, every allegiance leaves a mark, and every era of obedience eventually faces the reckoning of truth. The psychological and moral impact of this ritual burned as deeply as the flames themselves, shaping the post-war reconstruction, not only of Germany but of memory, identity, and ethics. Decades later, the women who once faced the fire would reflect on the experience with a mixture of shame, sorrow, and cautious resilience. They rebuilt their lives amid rubble and distrust, contributing to the rebirth of a nation that had to learn the hard way how to reconcile history with conscience. Their story is a testament to survival, not just of the body, but of the capacity to endure, confront guilt, and move toward understanding. In the end, the fire that consumed the uniforms did more than erase the symbols of a fallen regime. It illuminated the fragile, painful intersection of ideology, humanity, and history. It revealed the cost of obedience, the burden of memory, and the enduring possibility of redemption. Quiet, uncelebrated, yet essential. And as the smoke rose into a European sky still scarred by conflict, it carried with it a silent warning that the human spirit, even when complicit, can still confront truth and seek a way forward.